What drove Paroi to enslave the Jewish people? The clue to that lies in this week's Haftarah, as well as a powerful message why we had to suffer so badly in the Golus Mitzrayim, and a good lesson about how we're supposed to see and treat our fellow Jew. The Kvias Haftarah from Asedra is meaning our parsha. The idea behind making Haftarahs was to match the theme of the parsha. Especially when you remember that historically the reason they made Haftarahs in the first place was when it was forbidden for Jewish people to read the Torah. So they chose Haftarahs to remind us what the parsha was supposed to be. Is verstandig as the Haftarah darf sein in a parsha. So therefore it's logical that the Haftarah must reflect the theme of what the parsha is all about, in which case, let's pay attention to this week's Haftarah. Does it capture the theme of the parsha? Initially, yes, but then it seems to have other information that appears not to be linked to the parsha. That verstehen in the Haftarah von der Heintige Seder Voeira, we have to understand with regards to this week's Haftarah. The Haftarah is keledes zwei inyonim. The Haftarah has two parts to it, which are nevuos to Yecheskel, two different prophecies that Yecheskel is given. The first has an obvious link to the parsha. Aleph, the nevuah al Pari melech Mitzrayim kula, the fact that he has to prophesy about Paroi and the whole of Egypt, as the Eibishter vet chorev machen eretz Mitzrayim, that the Eibishter is going to desolate Egypt. Even though part of the prophecy includes the fact that he'll allow the Egyptians to come back to their land, but vet zizayin and amlocha shefola, they will forever become a lowly nation. They'll never regain their superpower status. And that will help all of the inhabitants of Egypt to recognize that Hashem is God. So that part of the Haftarah clearly links to the parsha. Here's the second part. Then there's a nevuah to the king of Babel at the time. As the because of the fact that he conquered Tyre, which is closer to Lebanon. The Eibishter will reward him for his actions, that he'll be able to conquer Mitzrayim. This is niklatik, it doesn't seem clear. The first part of the nevuah about the destruction of Mitzrayim matches the theme of the parsha. Because in Parshas Voeira, because Voeira is the parsha that speaks about the majority of the plagues that Hashem brought to destroy Mitzrayim. And that would help the Mitzrayim to acknowledge Hashem, which is exactly what Yecheskel is being told about the Egyptians of his time. Whereas the second prophecy is about rewarding the king of Babel, Nebuchadnezzar, for having conquered Tzur. What's that got to do with Mitzrayim? Okay, so you'll argue, well, the fact is his reward was that he gets to conquer Mitzrayim. That doesn't explain it, because his Aleph, first of all, does his Nora Prat and Ayin Tofel. That's a side issue. The main thrust of the prophecy is that he gets a reward. The fact that reward hurts the Egyptians, that's a detail. Beis Nachmer, furthermore, Nesinas Mitzrayim Yodai is it mean in our parsha. The fact that Mitzrayim is given to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babel, has nothing to do with our parsha. Because there's nothing in the parsha that speaks about giving Egypt over to the jurisdiction of any other nation. So how does this Haftarah match with the parsha? So the beer in them, the Rebbe is going to give us a very fascinating explanation, actually, which is, don't think that if the Haftarah matches the parsha, it just means that the storyline has to be the same. This is Torah we're talking about, not a history book. The Pirish Pnimi for Minyan HaParsha is, the deeper meaning of the fact that the Haftarah reflects the theme of the parsha is, Nit nor as in Amaduber in the Haftarah, davs an enlich zeminyan amdum in the parsha. It's not only that you have to match the theme, whatever you're discussing in the parsha has to be reflected in the Haftarah. Now, Torah is about lessons. It's about teaching us how we're supposed to conduct ourselves and connect to the Eibishter. Therefore, the primary lesson within the parasha has to be expressed in the Haftarah as well. So therefore, whatever the lesson installed in the Haftarah is, has to reflect whatever the core lesson of the parasha is. And it's very clear that every parasha in the Torah has at least a lesson for us in how we serve the Eibishter. That's why we call it Torah, which means instruction. Is the Haftarah Nevi'im? So what is the Haftarah about? Haftarah belongs to Nevi'im. Nevi'im takes what's in the Torah, and details and expands and explains what the Torah had been spoken about. Therefore, we can anticipate that the Haftarah will have greater detail and insight into what the lesson of the parasha was, so we can better understand the lesson of the parasha. Which is exactly what's happening in our scenario. Das, was die zweite Nevuah, is nikva geworden als Chelek von der Haftarah. The fact that our Chachamim included the second prophecy to Yechezkel as part of the Haftarah for Voeira is weil die Ha'ira'ah von dem is because the lesson for us in terms of our spiritual service was Nebuchadnezzar bekommen Dafkeres Mitzrayim als Schar verleuchtet sein Tzor. The fact that Nebuchadnezzar was specifically given Mitzrayim because he conquered Tzor. There's a lesson in that. Nikem as unter Ha'ira'ah for sich. That's not an independent lesson about another topic. It's a further elucidation of what it means for Mitzrayim to collapse. Which is introduced at the beginning of the Haftarah, which speaks about the destruction of Mitzrayim, and that clearly matches the parasha. So whatever the lesson of destroying Mitzrayim is, that lesson is further expanded in the story of Nebuchadnezzar being rewarded for conquering Tzor. Now, in order to understand what the theme and lesson of our parasha is, let's contextualize our parasha, because Voeira comes hot on the heels of the end of Parasha Shmois. Parashas Voeira kommt beimschach zum Sinn von Parasha Shmois, wo es wird erzählt wegen der Teilung von Eden zu Moshe und Aaron. Parasha Shmois concluded with the Jewish people complaining to Moshe and Aaron, as durch dem, was sie seinen gewähnt bei Paro melech Mitzrayim, that they went and confronted Paroi, didn't seem to turn out well for the Jewish people. Because what happened is the pain and pressure of the slavery became worse. And we know that Moshe then went and he conveyed this complaint, even from his own perspective, to the Eibishter as well, and that's how Parasha Shmois ended. On Eivdem is the Eibishter sent for Bascholas Parasha Seinu, to which the Eibishter responds, and that's the beginning of our Parasha. Don't worry, I've heard the cries of the Jewish people, and I pay attention to the original covenant that I made, and therefore, therefore I'm going to take you out of Mitzrayim and bring you to Eretz Yisrael. And immediately after that, the Makos begin with the Tzelt and Hemshech HaSedra as the parasha details. Now there's a burning question over here. How does this answer the complaint? As Moshe and Aaron that Moshe and Aaron going to Paro made the situation worse. How is that dealt with in this week's parasha? The fact that David says, I heard the Jewish people crying, which stimulated me remembering, so to speak, the covenant I made, and as a result of which I'll take you out. All of that could have happened earlier. In fact, logically, it should have happened earlier. Things should not have gotten worse, surely. In Parashat Shmois, where we were told that David heard the Yidden crying and remembered his bris, even while Moshe was still in Midian, at that point, things should have already started to move forward, and they should have started to experience Geula. And there never would have been a situation of the work becoming harder. Why did David orchestrate it in such a way that Moshe should come along and then things get worse before they get better? The von Gufis Mochach must be as the Shleimus von Voesker Gomer Veitzesi Gomer, that in order to bring the concept of remembering Hashem's covenant and therefore the Exodus to its ultimate state, could only happen if the Jews had experienced the maximum oppression of Egypt, including the fact that the work got harder before anything began to change. Now the question is, why? So, a key explanation is, remember that Geulas Mitzrayim is only a beginning of a path towards something very important, Matan Torah. And to get to Matan Torah, you actually have to shatter your old self in order to be ready for this exponential shift. Geulas Mitzrayim is given to Matan Torah. The experience of being exiled into Egypt was the preparation and the introduction to getting the Torah. One of the core shifts and innovations of Matan Torah is that now we have mitzvahs. And a mitzvah is a mitzvah implies bonding. Which means that after Matan Torah, the whole chap of keeping mitzvahs is that we keep mitzvahs because that's what the Eibishter wants. And therefore, because we're doing what the Eibishter wants, that forges a bond between us, limited humans, and the Eibishter, who is the instructor of those mitzvahs. That's a massive change that is going to happen once the Torah is given. Und das ist nicht nur bei der mitzvahs in Zug von Chokim. This is not only when we do mitzvahs that have no rational explanation we can conceive of. So therefore, we obviously are dedicated to doing just what the Eibishter wants. Weil man nicht kein Time, overmade is nicht kein Ort, als in dem Kima Mitzvah soll sein Reinmischen, sein Verstand oder Regisch, seine eigene Metzies. Not only in the realm of those mitzvahs where I cannot contaminate the mitzvah with my own perceptions or my own feelings, because there is nothing about the mitzvah that speaks to me. No oich mishpatim, but even those mitzvahs that have a logical basis. Such instructions that even had the Torah not spelled them out, they would have been the appropriate things to share. Darf men mekayim sein. The chiddush of Matan Torah is that we should keep those logical mitzvahs nicht weil they're going to seichel is mechayiv, not because they make sense to me, but because that's what the Eibishter instructed. So the entire chap of getting the Torah is that we're now dedicated to what the Eibishter wants because it's what the Eibishter told us. Not only doing what the Eibishter wants, but even learning Torah has to be done in a way that is aligned with submission to the Eibishter. Even though the content of Torah is something we can understand and therefore our minds can completely grasp and encapsulate, as the Alter Rebbe tells us in Tanya, that information. But that does not mean that Torah is human intellect. No, says Torah Hashem. This is the Eibishter's Torah. This is the Eibishter's infinite wisdom, which is infinitely beyond the scope of the human or any other created experience. Now, except Eibishter in his greatness is able to bring that Torah down to a level that we can understand it, but that does not in any way diminish the fact that it's infinite wisdom of God. That's why we have to say Birchas HaTorah before we can learn Torah, because we have to acknowledge the Bitul Tzum Nois in HaTorah, that we're not learning this Torah in an egoistic sense, that here I am, this great intellect who's now going to tackle this incredible information, but rather that we are here with complete submission to the one who gave the Torah. Because the truth is, the only way that limited human seichel has a chance of grasping the truth of Torah is only when the person is in a state of complete bittul, of complete submission. This is because then you can take on the Eibishter's wisdom rather than contaminating it with human perspective. So the key is that Matan Torah requires a suspension of self, a complete dedication to the Eibishter. Therefore, to prepare the Jews to receive the Torah, to sein kelim of Sinem and Torah mitzvahs, to be the appropriate recipients who could actually handle the Eibishter's infinite mitzvahs, which is his Ratzon, and the Eibishter's infinite Torah, which is his Chochmah. To get us there, we had to go through the suffering of Egypt, including the difficulty and the oppression of that Galus. Because what happens when a person suffers is it cracks and breaks their original sense of self, the ego. You could see this practically. Any person who has a serious challenge or suffering in their life, it breaks the person. To the extent that the person loses their confidence, their sense of self, their ego. On their bittul is dedicated to Matan Torah. So that is why we have this principle of intense slavery and pain and oppression at that point in history, because it broke the shell, the framework of who the Jewish people were, to open them up to be able to receive the Eibishter's infinite Torah. Now, it's not only the Jews who had to break. Just like the Yidden had to go through this intense experience of bittul to prepare themselves for Matan Torah. Something similar had to happen to the world. And das from Makis Mitzrayim and Mapolas Parimelech Mitzrayim and the Moshe Bekippah from the ganze Welt. How does this happen? We bring down Egypt, which is the world superpower, and specifically Paroi, who is the authority over the entire world at that time. He's the dictator of the world. Now, if you pay a little bit more attention to Paroi, you recognize that not only is Paroi in the way and has to be broken in order for Matan Torah to happen, he's the antithesis of Matan Torah and the bittul that Torah is supposed to express. Because Klipas Paroi is Shekef HaYeshus. The specific spiritual aberration that Paroi represents is this extreme sense of self, extreme ego. He says, who's the Eibishter that I should listen to him? Und es wird noch mehr ausgeteilt in der Haftarah, and as we've mentioned, the Haftarah often provides more details. Here too, Paramelech Mitzrayim says, Asher Omar Li Orivani Sisini. He's the one who says, I created the Nile River, which is the source of all sustenance in Egypt, and I created myself. Absolute ego. Therefore, Paramelech Mitzrayim is the Menaged to Matan Torah. Paroi is the antithesis of the giving of the Torah. Because to receive the Torah, as mentioned, you have to have absolute bittul, and paroi is absolute self. Therefore, because the Jewish people suffered through the Golus of Mitzrayim, which caused bittul for the Jewish people, is gekommen, es hat gebracht im Apollo schwer von Tekef HaYeshus from Welt. Once the Jewish people experience bittul, the natural influence that will have on the world is that the world will break down in a sense of bittul. The bittul von Klippas Parim and Shalto Moshe Bekipa, primarily breaking the stranglehold that Paroi has over the whole world, on sein Yeshus and his personal ego, durch die Makkos. And that's going to be achieved through the Makkos. As we see at the end of the parasha, the Paroi breaks and he says, okay, I acknowledge the Eibishter is right, I'm wrong, my people are wrong. So here's the continuum. The Jewish people go through their whole experience of Bittul. When they reach the end of that experience and they have now achieved Bittul, that then spills over to Paroi and Mitzrayim that they break, and they have a much harsher bittul, the bittul of disappearance, of completely being destroyed. So now their inyan askripas Paroi melech Mitzrayim is the menaged to Matan Torah. Now that we have this principle, which is Paroi representing ego and severe ego, is the antithesis of the receiving of the Torah. Ve'klera is gebracht in the Haftarah. It's then even clarified further in the Haftarah, or kanalas the Haftarah is the meforet or mevarid the hayrav from the Seder, because as we mentioned, the goal of the Haftarah is to take what the main message and teaching of the parasha is, and to expand and expound on it. If my polas Mitzrayim zayin in the Haftarah mevort tzvei taimim uvismichos v'hemshech zeloseh. So first of all, let's see what the Nabi Yechezkel is told. Why is it that Paroi will be destroyed? And what's interesting is that there are two reasons given side by side, and they appear to be completely unrelated reasons, and yet they're given in one continuum. First of all, first state is the Mapolavet Kumen, that the first reason why Mitzrayim has to be destroyed is because instead of being a true support to the Jewish people, they've been a support like a reed, where, as Rashi says, during the time of Sancherib, during the time of Bavel, the Yidden thought they could rely on Mitzrayim, and as they leaned on them like a reed, it bent over, there was no support. Because the Yidden relied on the promises of the Egyptians to help them. And the Egyptians did not come through on their promises, therefore they deserve to be destroyed. That's reason number one. Und gleich dennoch is the pasuk mamshich, straight after which the pasuk continues. Therefore the Eibishter says, I'm going to bring a sword against you, Paroi, on his Messiah, and there it says, for what reason? Because you claim that you created the river and yourself. That implies that the reason Paroi is being destroyed is because he was so full of himself and claimed that I exist because I made myself exist. Now these seem to be two completely unrelated issues. How they treated the Jewish people and his incredibly overinflated ego. Und doch bindet the Navi in ein smichas v'hemshech kanal, yet Yechezkel puts them into one conversation, as if they're one theme. It's the fun verstandig, which makes clear, therefore, for us, as die zwei avles von Mitzrayim is ein atetzor von der zweite kidele kamon, the two evils of the Egyptians, one is the result of the other, the natural result of the other. So in order to understand this, let's go remember, Paroi is the antithesis of Matan Torah. Matan Torah is where we come to do everything that the Eibishter says because the Eibishter said so, including Mishpatim, as the Rebbe has discussed numerous times, that even Mishpatim, which are logical, our dedication to those Mishpatim should be because it's the Eibishter's Ratzon. Okay, mirumas bazeh. This is hinted in the fact that the Aser Sadirbas include such basic things like do not murder. To teach us that the reason we don't murder is because the Eibishter is our God who told us not to murder, not because we think it's objectionable. So now let's link that back to our Haftarah. Why did it turn out that the Egyptians did not follow through on any of their promises to support the Jewish people? Is the Sibderuf Geven Zain Yeshus. That is a direct result of the fact that they behave completely against the way that we're taught to behave. In other words, when you accept that what the Eibishter says is absolute truth, then whether you feel like it or not, whether you agree with it or not, you do it. Whereas when you build everything on your own yeshus, you could say something and then decide, actually, it no longer applies, as the Egyptians did to the Jewish people. The fact that he claimed Paroi as the leader of Mitzrayim, that he is self-made, that's what led him to let the Jewish people down in critical times of their history. Now, this principle that the megalomania of Paroi leads to the fact that he mistreats the Jewish people, that is a direct reflection of our parsha. It's yet another example of the Haftarah elucidating a message that is already in the parsha. The Torah offers two reasons why the Eibishter brought the plagues against Mitzrayim. We've already mentioned, because the Eibishter wanted the Mitzrayim to acknowledge that he is Hashem. But if you go back to the Bris Ben Abasarim, the Eibishter told Avram Avinu then that I'm going to judge those people who oppressed the Jews. So therefore there's an aspect of punishment as well. Punishment for what? For how the Jewish people were treated. So there you see the two themes: rejection of Hashem because of his ego, and mistreatment of the Jewish nation. We've already now seen, thanks to the Haftarah, that the two are related. The fact that Parah rejected the Eibishter's existence, as he tells Moshe clearly, I don't know Hashem, is given to Sibbe, was it hat him der Führt zum Shabbos einen Penik in Eden, Beifenochi Gorua. That's the direct cause of the terrible way in which he treated the Jewish people. In fact, the degree of oppression and barbarism that happened at that time is beyond what normal humans would do. Why? Because it completely rejects the Eibishter. So therefore we're seeing a correlation over here. Mitzrayim is the blockage to receiving Torah. Torah is all about bittul to the Eibishter, and therefore doing what the Eibishter wants unconditionally. And the problem over here is that Paroi is so caught up in his own reality, he's unable to see or do that. So now that we know that the core principle of mitzvahs is you do a mitzvah, why? Because that's what the Eibishter said. And this is what Paroi has a big problem with, and Paroi therefore has to be removed from the picture. That when you come from that perspective, recognizing that to do a mitzvah is primarily about doing what the Eibishter wants, then you come to the realization that the most important thing is doing what the Eibishter wants. In other words, let's compare how it is to be a Jewish person today versus how it was to be committed to the Eibishter in the time of the Avos. The Kim mitzvah shel Avos for Matan Torah is in Yonin Avodah B'Kerech HaNivroim. We know that the Avos, or anybody in that time before the Torah was given, the way that they went about their Avodas Hashem was with human capacity. Vad l'shosham sheresh HaNivroim, even reaching up to the maximum level that humans are able to access, sheresh HaNivroim, the root from which creation comes. In other words, they're able to access they're able to access godliness as it is already manifest within the reality of Seder Shtalshus, a structured reality. Where each world is in its own reality, separate and distinct from every other world. And therefore, the reality of the physical and the reality of the spiritual are completely unrelated. They're completely separate from each other. In other words, in those days, every mitzvah, which is obviously a spiritual thing, each mitzvah has its particular content and theme, which achieves a particular kind of spiritual growth and refinement. And that impacts the world to some extent, that there's some spirituality introduced into the world. And most importantly, in the intellectual and emotional experience of the person who's doing the mitzvah. That's pretty much what the Avos did when they were doing Torah mitzvahs, spiritual growth and development, and how it affected them in their own soul development. And also having an impact on the world, until you reach the ultimate state of dedication to Hashem, which is that you become a vehicle for Hashem. You become incorporated into the world of Atzilus, which is completely holy and completely spiritual. Now you might say, but the fact is that the Avos also did physical activities even before the Torah was given. That's true. But it's the Asiya given a Tofel und an Ausdruck von dem Ruchni. The physical actions they did were completely an accessory and kind of irrelevant compared to what they were trying to achieve with those actions, which was a spiritual experience. Was der Fall ist, dauert die meisten Mitzvahs Gashmis nicht given as a bediek in alle Protim wie die Kima Mitzvahs nach Matan Torah, which is why the physical specifications of what they did or what they did it with at that time was far more open-ended than it is today. So, for example, today tefillin have to be black cubes and they have to be a certain size and they have to be angular edges and they have to have the right parashias, etc. Those days, Yaakov Avinu took a few sticks, stuck them into the ground, and he achieved the spiritual equivalent of tefillin. So the reason for that is because prior to the giving of the Torah, all of the investment in mitzvahs was driven by human capacity, and therefore it could only stretch as far as human capacity could stretch, which does not have the ability to harmonize the spiritual with the physical. We are in a different position now. The Eibishter has given us the Torah, which means that the Eibishter has invested his infinite power into our mitzvahs. We now have the power not just of the creations, but of the Creator, which is beyond the distinctions between the physical and the spiritual. Therefore, we're able to actually do mitzvahs today that impact the physical. And that's why they have these very specific physical requirements, time, space, etc. Because we're infusing holiness into the physical, which prior to Matan Torah was impossible. Therefore, in our world, the primary aspect of a mitzvah is not so much the intention, where every person obviously has their own experience of that intention. Now, the most important thing is, what are you doing? Because when you do the mitzvah, as the Eibishter told you to, that creates the bond between you and Hashem, and that's the primary thing that Matan Torah introduced to us. In fact, it's a very subtle but important point. The Ratzon Atzmi in mitzvahs, the fact that the Eibishter's Ratzon, which is the essence of the Eibishter's Ratzon, is invested in a mitzvah, is on I'm doing a mitzvah. That is what the Eibishter wants. It's not hidden. It's not a mystery. That's what the Eibishter wants. This is clear. He said, "Put on tefillin." These are tefillin. I'm putting them on. It's not like it's some kind of a container that's holding within it spirituality. Whereas if I'm doing something spiritual, okay, spirituality is a framework within which you could bring the divine energy. That's not a keli that is able to facilitate the Eibishter's absolute ratzon, because the Eibishter's ratzon is completely beyond the capacity and the structure and the experience of created beings. So what are we saying? That the whole purpose of Matan Torah is to get to a point that we're dedicated to Hashem's mitzvahs because they're His mitzvahs, and we're studying Hashem's Torah because it's His Torah, without any sense of self, with absolute bittul. The hurdle we had to get over in order to achieve that is our own ego, and much more so Paro, who is the klippa of overblown ego, and that's how Paro has to be destroyed. And as a result, we come out with the recognition of the fact that dedication to the Eibishter is key, and specifically doing what the Eibishter said. That will help us create the link why that part of the Haftarah would speak about the reward for Nebuchadrezzar when actually the parasha is all about the downfall of Mitzrayim. And then was redt wegen den Tashlim Schal zu Nebuchadrezzar, verleuchtet sein Zeur, ist lecher nicht verstandig. When you think about it, the fact that Nebuchadrezzar is being rewarded for having conquered Tzur seems strange. What, did he conquer Tzur out of dedication to Hashem? By my name Tzur is Nebuchadrezzar nicht gewesen äußern zum Keimsen der Eibishter's Ratzon. There's no question Nebuchadrezzar's intention was not to fulfill some high divine aspiration by conquering Tzur. That the Eibishter wanted Tzur to be conquered, I'm going to be the guy to volunteer to do it. No, he did it for himself. Nebuchadrezzar wanted to conquer the entire world. He wanted to be this dictator over the entire world. And especially had an interest in Tzur for strategic reasons. Firstly, it's a coastal town, so it's very good for naval strategy. It's also on the way from Babel to Mitzrayim. Or perhaps it would have been a potential threat to his attack on Mitzrayim. So in other words, he conquered Tzur for completely personal strategic reasons. And for was kommt ihm der Schar? So why is it being rewarded for this? Is the pasuk medayik? So if you remember, the pasuk said specifically he is rewarded for the actions that he took. We're not paying attention to what motivated those actions. Yes, they were completely self-interested. But here the focus is he did what needed to be done, and therefore he's rewarded for that. In other words, the fact is, the Eibishter wanted Tzor to be conquered, and he's the one who did it, so the Maaseh was fulfilled. There's no question, if it hadn't been Nebuchadnezzar, the Eibishter's intention for Tzor to be conquered would have happened through somebody else. The fact is, he did what the Eibishter wanted, even if his intention is not matched with the Eibishter's intention. Which is one of the main lessons we're taking out of this week's parasha. The lesson that you've got to do what the Eibishter wants you to do, whether you are aligned or not. And that's going to teach us a profound lesson. When a Jew is the recipient of goodness by somebody else, don't get caught up in thinking, maybe the person didn't have my best intentions at heart. Maybe he was self-interested. He wants his name in lights. He wants to recognition from the community, whatever it is. Or maybe you're going to say, listen, he can't help himself. He's just naturally a good person. So it's not about me. It's not about serving the Eibishter. It's just his nature. So I don't have to thank him for the goodness that he did. Because he has no choice. That's just how he operates. That's how he's wired. He's a good person. I don't have to start thanking him. Therefore the Torah teaches us, even Nebuchadnezzar, who unquestionably was self-interested, the Eibishter rewarded him. Why? Because what he did was what the Eibishter wanted done. So how much more so when it's a Jewish person who does something good to us? What you have to assume, he didn't just do it because he's going through the motions. Because the nature, as we know, of the Jewish people is to be benevolent and to be kind. So therefore, he probably feels kindness as well. But the lesson goes even deeper. This gives a deeper appreciation of what the Baal Shem Tov teaches us. That we have to love every single Jew, even if they're on the other end of the world. I've never met him in my life. Now, how could I love somebody I've never met? Because every single Jew, regardless of what state they're in, has undoubtedly done many very good things aligned with what the Torah wants. Like the Gemara tells us, even the simplest Jew or the emptiest Jew is filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. When you consider that every action, positive action, and even a positive thought impacts the whole world, B'lashon Rambam, as the Rambam famously tells us in Hilchos Tshuva, that one good deed can flip the scale of the entire world and bring salvation to the whole world. That means that every single Jew on the planet owes their salvation to every other Jew on the planet, because every other Jew has done good things and they benefited us, because that's how they designed the world. And even though that person didn't give a second thought to the fact that I'm going to do something positive in order to benefit somebody else. And there's no question that the person did not intend to do this positive thing on behalf of a Jew who's never seen on the other end of the world. But we have to be conscious of the fact that realistically we are consistently receiving goodness from other Jews doing good things. Who cares about their intentions? The action was done. We have to acknowledge and be grateful for that. We actually have to love every single Jewish person to the extent of after the Reichel Kamoicha because of what they have done for us, even unwittingly. And that kind of Avos Yisrael certainly will bring Mashiach now.